something I've heard a lot about this week, or I've spoke to audiences about, something that's kind of on my mind. And we're going to do that today as well. We're going to talk about the growing rural-urban divide, and what are some of the impacts of that. And of course, as I usually do, I go into the RealAg tickle trunk, so to speak, and I find some clips. And we got some great ones today from Daryl Bricker, CEO of Ipsos, as well as Sean Spear from the Public Policy Forum. We're going to kind of explore this topic. I've even got some slides. Like we're going all out today on this Friday edition of the show. So let's get to the intro. And this is about my fourth straight hour of broadcasting. Gonna bring the energy. I'm teed up, so to speak. I had about 3 Earl Grey teas just now, so I think I'm ready to rock. So let's get started and get going with the countdown. Here we go, RealAg Live. Maybe, if I can find the reel. Here we go. This is RealAg Live. And welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. Hope you're having yourself a great Friday, having a great day. You're ready for the weekend. I know around here the weather is turning to very much a spring feel. It's like 16 degrees Celsius, which I think is about 60 Fahrenheit. And I would imagine in southern Alberta, based on how dry it is, nice temperatures this weekend, I think we're going to see some people putting seed in the ground, specifically cereals. Not canola, but cereals. So it is that time of the year, and it's good to see. Hopefully winter's over. We could use some moisture in certain parts of the prairies for sure. Today is Freestyle Friday, which means we can talk about any issue you want to. I have kind of selected a bit of something that's been on my mind the majority of the week. I gave a presentation this morning to a group of Syngenta growers in Ontario for Willie's Word, as they call it. And we had a lot of fun. I talked about the 5 trends that I'm watching right now, and we're going to pick on one of those trends here today. In the promo I said, Shaun and friends. My friends are my clips. I think these guys are friends too. I'll call them friends. I've got some clips with Daryl Bricker, a CEO of Ipsos, as well as Sean Spear from the Public Policy Forum. We're going to talk today about the impacts of the growing rural-urban divide. It is real. Now, for people that are in Ontario, as an example, it's like, yeah, this is everyday life. But for farmers producing crops in some other provinces like Alberta, maybe even Manitoba, it's kind of a new thing. It's becoming more and more of an issue as we see cities like Calgary, for example, grow and maybe change a little bit politically. And we're going to hear a little bit about that from Daryl Bricker here today on the show. If you want to participate in today's show, all you got to do is be like Kara, who put a comment in there. You just got to enter it in the box, whether you're watching on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook. So the challenges of the rural-urban divide, and what I said to the group of Syngenta growers this morning was that this is really an issue because it really, really does shape a lot of policy when it comes to agriculture. And traditionally, it was just like we think of this in terms of votes and things like that. But it's impacting agriculture as well because in this time, because what we're seeing is a lot of policies being developed that impact agriculture, and the ag minister isn't really in the loop or not driving the process forward. And the carbon tax probably is a most recent example that a lot of you would identify with. And so a lot of times in my presentations, I show this slide, the rural versus urban divide. Two bearded fellows, of course, Hillbilly Jim there on the left. Who didn't love Hillbilly Jim? That was when wrestling was not quite real, but it might have been better than today. People actually wrestled. Anyway, it's not about wrestling. But yeah, this is a real thing, and I try to capture this kind of visually here as you see. So what I show a lot of audiences is this slide, because this is Canada, and it showcases some of the differences we have politically and how this possibly changes into the future. And one of the first things that we notice when we look at this electoral map from the last election is how blue Western Canada is. And of course, that is the showcases, as you know, how the West voted very, very much conservative. Jim Carr in Winnipeg, one of the lone liberal electees under this government in the last election. Now, what we don't a lot of times focus on, and what is missed by a lot of people in Western Canada, is how blue southwestern Ontario is. It's just as rural and just as conservative as some of their peers in the West. And what has happened now is we're moving more and more to the system, similar in the U.S. It's a very similar situation where rural equals conservative, urban equals liberal, and maybe a lot of the fight is over the suburbs in terms of being up for grabs. And of course, Stephen Harper, that was one of his big political strategies, was winning the suburbs. And we're going to hear about that a little bit from Daryl Bricker here in a little bit in terms of, is there an opportunity for agriculture to find a friend politically in the suburbs? So how does all of this impact what's going on in terms of rural versus urban? Well, we saw in terms of creation of food policy, we saw the creation of the food guide changes. There was a big emphasis put on what people were thinking in urban communities as opposed to what agriculture's viewpoint was. In terms of the food guide, agriculture was very much left completely out of the discussion for the most part. The other part of this is just how urban sprawl is taking away farmland. And here's where the hypocrisy really does come in. So if you think about some of the things in terms of the climate strategy the federal government has, we saw this in the Clean Fuel Standard rules that originally came out, trying to prevent farmers from cutting down tree lines, trying to create more farmland, and some of the carbon impacts that has. But at the same time, well, telling farmers they can't do that. At the same time, we're paving over great farmland every single day in this country to put up a new Costco parking lot or to build the latest subdivision. There's some hypocrisy in that, and I think that's where farmers sort of scratch their head on what's really going on here. One of the further concerns I would say, though, is how locked in that rural vote is in rural communities. And so, like we have seen a lot as of late, agriculture has a hard time because it is not voted liberal in the last election really at all, because the federal government knows that no matter what they do, they're probably not going to get that rural conservative vote, right? Like there's a history of this. They've seen it. They have examples. They have case studies. This isn't something new. And so it's hard for us to kind of push through and use we really don't have a lot of political leverage when it comes to the federal Liberals. Okay, it's a real challenge. But the other part the same is true with the other party in many ways, is that just like the federal Liberals know which way the vote goes, so do conservative governments. They also realize no matter what they do to the industry, no matter what decisions they make that may have negative impacts on agriculture, farmers may squawk, but it doesn't mean they're voting Liberal. And so they can do whatever they want to our industry as well. This is also just as dangerous. Some would use the example of the Kenney government cutting some agricultural research as an example where people didn't, if Notley had done that, oh my goodness, we'd be storming the legislature. In the case of Kenney, it was like, well, they probably know what's best for us. We saw this in 2016 election with President Trump, where for 4 years he did a lot of things that were not exactly for the U.S. biofuel industry. Yet when it came to this past fall's election, those votes were locked in, and he got the votes. Even though for 4 years he was his actions did not speak being very pro-ethanol in states like Iowa. Okay, so I think that is a danger for sure. I'm going to pull this back up. So what I want to show you here to start off is I see there's the slides. We're getting really fancy here. This is good. Okay, I'm going to play you a clip. And this one is with Daryl Bricker, CEO of Ipsos. And I asked Daryl, this is an interview from last June. And I asked him the question, what does the future of Canada actually look like? Here's what he had to say. Okay, so what does the future of Canada kind of look like here in some of your research? What are some of the highlights, things we need to be really aware of?
Well, I think that the single biggest thing is that the country that we think we are is not the country that we are. So we have this impression of what Canada is, the three founding cultures, the English, the French, and the Indigenous community. The idea that, we're part of the Great White North, that we're a very youthful country, that youth defines the marketplace. All of those things are going by the wayside. I mean, 22% of the Canadian population now was not born in this country. Like a fifth of the population was not born in this country. They're not part of the English, French, and Indigenous story that we tell about ourselves. Over 80% of us now live in a community of over 1,000 people, and 4 cities where 40% of us live. So the 3 big ones plus Calgary. We only live, between 92 and 93% of the population lives within 100 kilometers of the U.S. border. And the median age of a Canadian today is 41, which is hardly young.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things I've heard you talk about before is how we could have growing Western influence or more people moving west and maybe a little bit less of the traditional Laurentian elite.
Yeah, the Laurentian Elite is a term that actually came out of a book that I was involved in called The Big Shift that John Ibbotson and I wrote together. And it was a way of describing essentially the Central Canadian elite, those people who established what it was to be Canadian. And they lived predominantly, and they were mostly men, almost universally men, who lived in, a couple of places. They lived in in downtown Ottawa, they lived in downtown Montreal, and they lived in downtown Toronto. And if you didn't live in any of those places, you really didn't have any influence in anything that was of national significance. And what's changed is the weight of the population has shifted, hence the name The Big Shift, but it's also a big part of next, right? So the next country is going to be more Pacific-oriented and more Western-oriented because that's the way where the weight of the population has moved. And not only is the population growing faster in Western Canada than it's growing in any other part of the country, with the exception of the suburbs of Toronto, it's also a younger population, so the birth rate continues to be higher in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta than it is, say, for example, in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. So what happens is the weight of Western Canada continues to grow year by year in our population, and the weight of particularly Quebec and Atlantic Canada continues to decline.
That was Daryl Bricker, CEO of Ipsos. We're going to hear more from Daryl here in a second. So what did we hear there from Daryl? We heard that a fifth of Canadians, 1 out of 5, were not born here. So they don't identify with the English, French, or Indigenous heritage. So that's one thing. The birth rates in the prairies is actually higher than other areas of Canada. and the median age is 41. And he mentioned that that's not very young. And I take great offense to that because I'm 42. So I'm not sure what Daryl was trying to say there. But so this is interesting. So does this mean that as more people are, if we're becoming more of a Pacific culture where more people are moving west, of course, a lot of that is ending up in places like obviously Vancouver and on Victoria or Vancouver Island and on the coast, but he did mention the prairies as well. Does that mean that there's growing power amongst conservatives in the West long term, which balances out this kind of urban-rural divide that we have seen politically? I actually asked Bricker that exact question, and here's what he had to say. What I find very interesting, just going back really quickly here to wrap up, to the growing influence of the West and growing population in the West, does that mean that we're going to see a growing base of conservative power in the West? Like, that may be a grand assumption. Maybe it's not. Maybe the prairie's becoming more liberal.
Well, there's some argument that what happens in the cities is that what will end up happening in the country is that we will have our downtown elites, and that's what we talked about in the Big Shift, where it's like a string of pearls across the country, and there's an electoral coalition for that. So it's downtown Edmonton. Calgary is always going to be interesting, but you elected Mayor Nenshi.
Yeah, Notley got some seats in Calgary.
But there's going to be a transformation there. Places like Vancouver, Victoria, like a string of pearls across the country. And then there's going to be rural and smaller town Canada, which, by the way, shrinks every year. Now, as a result of COVID, maybe we'll see a change of that. I don't think so. And then there will be the big battleground, which will be the suburbs, because those are the fastest growing communities in Canada. 90% of the population growth over the last decade has been in car commuting suburbs. And I'm the first person who ever told you that.
How does COVID, because your book came out right kind of during all of this, how does it change anything in terms of some of your predictions in the book?
No, I actually don't think so. I think what it does is it highlights everything that COVID has done has exacerbated or increased and highlighted the changes that were already happening. So the reason COVID was such a catastrophe for seniors in this country was because there's more of them. Mm-hmm. The reason that we have the hotspots that we do is we've become a more urban country. The reason that things were transferred the way that they were and the disease came into the country was because we have so much immigration and we've become so much of a trading country that we're flying everywhere all over the world, from Asia to Europe, wherever the sources were. There's more people who are coming to and fro in the country. So all the things that I talk about in Next were simply highlighted by what happened, or were highlighted by COVID. They were really pointed out. So, for example, and somebody asked me this question the other day, and I think it's a really good question. And my answer was, okay, imagine Canada in 1960. Would the impact have been the same? The median age of a Canadian was 25.
Wow.
Many more of us lived in smaller town and rural Canada. There wasn't nearly the amount of immigration and foreign population in the country. The potential for the spread, because we didn't travel as much as we used to, the impact would have been very, very different, if at all. Yeah. So everything that I talk about in Next is just highlighted by what COVID has created. So the reason COVID had the specific impact it had was because our people have changed.
That was Daryl Bricker, CEO of Ipsos. Always love talking to Daryl. He was talking about Next. The reference there is his book that he co-wrote with John Ibbotson. Also, The Big Shift is another one that he referenced in one of the prior clips. So I encourage you to check out Daryl's books. He does a fantastic job. And he also always does a great job of giving us access to ask him questions, because he is interested in what's going on in terms of rural communities. So what he's talked about there is this idea is, as we see more people move into the West, will they follow kind of political lines of conservatism like the West currently is? He talked about the string of pearls, right? Being those pearls being cities, and so we'll see. Like, you look in other geographies, like use Ontario as the example. Just because some is London super conservative, things like that kind of narrative, and so the challenge becomes if rural communities are going to lose more and more of their political clout over time, as if it feels like it could get any worse. How do we make sure that these rural areas are able to function and survive for the long term? And will some of those people that are from these urban centers who are running the government, will they actually have legitimate, tangible concern for some of these rural communities as people get further, just like we've seen with farming, where people, the further away somebody gets from the farm, the less attached they are to it. The further people get away from rural communities, from they grew up in a rural town, the further they get away from that, the less important it is to them. And I think there's some real sort of parallels there that we need to keep our eye out for, and be really, really concerned about it. And from a rural community standpoint, how do we make sure that we have these services and the infrastructure available to us no different than they have in an urban community, which obviously has much more of the people power, people much more sparsely populated in a rural center. So I'm going to play a clip for you with Shaun Spear from the Public Policy Forum. This is going back a couple months, and Shaun wrote a great paper, a research paper on rural-urban divide and the future of work. And it was very, very interesting. We had a very good discussion. It was actually right here on RealAg Live. And the question I asked Shaun is, how do we make sure certain parts of Canada are not left behind? Here's what he had to say. How do you were in public policy. What are some of the things we need to be doing to make sure there aren't areas of Canada left behind?
Well, this is the question that I'm seized with these days, Shaun, not just in this paper, but more generally. And I've been seized with it really since 2016, since Donald Trump was elected in the United States. It was a huge surprise, of course. That election has been characterized by some as the revenge of places that didn't matter. That is to say, there were communities and regions across the United States that had been neglected for a long time by policymakers across the political spectrum. What I've taken from that is that we can't make the same mistake here. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about the economic prospects of people living in rural communities, the economic circumstances in rural communities in Canada, and the need for public policymakers to make sure that we're trying to create opportunity not just in our major urban centers, but in every corner of the country. And this is such a fundamental point. Between 2015 and 2019, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver were responsible for 2/3 of all net new job creation in this country. We really do have an economy that is increasingly concentrated in a small number of large urban centers. And I think that has obvious economic consequences for the communities that aren't participating in that economic activity. But more importantly, it has political and social consequences if we're not paying closer attention to trying to extend opportunity to every community in the country. So that's a long way of saying I think your question is, in my view, one of the most important ones we ought to be asking ourselves. How do we make sure your postal code doesn't dictate your life chances and your economic opportunities? Now, it's not easy because we're facing pretty powerful market forces that are pushing capital and innovation and employment in our major centers. But I do think there are some steps that policymakers can take to try to push and pull capital and opportunity more evenly across the country. This particular paper sets out some of those. I'd be pleased to talk about them. But more generally, I think it needs to start with a premise, start with a recognition that this is one of the most important questions facing our society, not just from an economic point of view, but from a political one and a social one.
You can find that entire interview with Shaun Spear at realagriculture.com/live. Encourage you to do that. It was a fascinating discussion about rural-urban divide, which we've been talking about here today. I love this. He talks about the 2016 election in the U.S., the revenge of places that didn't matter. Today on RealAg Radio, we talk a little bit about communicating with consumers, and it fits very much into this rural-urban divide discussion. And Christina Crowley-Arkley was on the panel, and one of the things that she asked about was, how is it that on climate policy, it seems that farmers in the U.S. have been much more successful in getting in the head of the Biden administration compared to Canada? And what's the case study there? What's the why? And my theory on that is it's quite simple. It's the fact that they have an electoral college, in the sense that just because there are hundreds of millions of people living in California, it does, or tens of millions, it doesn't mean that they can, they get so many seats that they can control government. So just in the U.S., as we see more people living on the coast, less in the middle of the country, the coast can't control the vote. And so there are 2 senators from every state. And in Canada, we don't have that kind of situation. Could you imagine if there was, sort of seat representation based on each province? It would be, people would probably have a huge problem with that in parts of Ontario and Quebec, where the bulk of the population is. So that's the difference. And those governments have to speak to people in rural communities, as the Democrats found it in 2016, when, definitely farm country said, hey, you're not talking to us at all. As Hillary Clinton never even I don't think she visited Ohio once. So that's, I think, one of the main differences here. Kara says, how do you make sure your postal code doesn't define your political opportunities? What a fantastic quote. I totally agree, Kara. I wrote it down here. Isn't that something, right? We talk about, the land, Canada, and, trying to provide opportunities to people of all situations, whether that's economically, socially, no matter what race you are. And Shaun brings up a very good point. If we don't think about this, and we don't plan for it, and make sure that we're not just letting these strong market forces dictate the direction that we go. If we don't do that, if we don't get in the middle of it and worry about this, your postal code will define what those opportunities are for you. What are some of those things? Well, I think this is where rural broadband really fits in. Absolutely. So how do you expect to get people to move into rural communities if you don't have things like rural broadband, right? And it's not just like we've talked lots about in the past about being able to access Netflix and do those kinds of things. It's about being able to just even run your business. And as we see more people doing at-home businesses or at-home work during COVID-19, we've all heard stories about how people don't even have enough bandwidth in some of these rural communities to hook into just a regular Zoom call, or their kids trying to do their homework over Google Meet have to be taken to the local grain elevator to basically hack into the Wi-Fi at the grain elevator to try to get any sort of a coverage. These are issues that really, really impact rural communities. No different than if you had, hey, does that town, that town's really cute and quaint. I could see us living there. This would be a great lifestyle. Does it have a school? Check. Does it have a doctor? Check. Well, it's got a general store. That's good. What's the internet like? Oh, it's like 2 down and maybe like 0.5 up. Yeah, I know. That's going to be really hard for me to run my my at-home business. I think we better look elsewhere. Maybe this just isn't for us. Those are the kind of things that really do play a part in today's world, for sure. So I think rural broadband is one of those examples. Also, infrastructure when it comes to thinking things like I think about logistical infrastructure, and this is more from a farming aspect. Do we have the infrastructure in place to allow for the products that rural communities are producing for them to get to the market. So in a lot of cases in agriculture, we talk about, rail infrastructure, we talk about port infrastructure, grain handling, to be able to get these products from the farm to the export markets out of the coast. So, those are the kind of things too that fit into this. It's not just infrastructure investment in the community, it's infrastructure investment that allows that community to economically thrive. If it economically thrives, more people get attracted to it. We saw this in the oil boom in parts of Saskatchewan and Alberta. As the oil boom happened and the economy started to hum and started to go, people were willing to live in small towns. As the oil crashed, like badly, some people were trapped in some very expensive houses in some towns of 15,000 people. Okay, I want to play one more clip here. Is with Darrell Bricker. So we alluded to this earlier, and that is, okay, so we know that because just the way that votes happen in Canada, it's really tough for rural communities to have that kind of political power. Now, are there allies? Can we find some allies in some other areas of Canada that maybe we align with? Now, one of those areas is the suburbs, because we know that cities vote Liberal. That's kind of locked in. We talked about how rural communities vote very conservative. But what about the suburbs? Maybe that's an ally for us. Let's watch and see what Darrell Bricker has to say about that. Here we go. Can Ag find a partner in this, this quest to try to gain a little bit more profile with the current federal government? And we had a guest last week that talked about, it could be people in the suburbs. Based on your research, and you mentioned the growing suburbs of Toronto, is there some sort of connection there, some common interest? People in the West that are involved in agriculture and agri-food, is there some common interest with people in the suburbs?
Yes. And the reason is because the people you're talking about are basically private sector entrepreneurs. I mean, the emphasis of the family farm has moved from the family to the farm. I mean, it's become a business. And people who are living in the suburbs of a city like Toronto are invariably commuters, and they're people who are private sector taxpayers. They're not the downtown elite. They're not the Laurentian elite. They're immigrants disproportionately. They're people who are not part of that conversation that takes place among the Liberal coalition that leads this country. They're people who are looking for an alternative. And as Stephen Harper put them back together with Western Canada in 2011, there's an opportunity for somebody to do that in the next federal election, which will probably be in the spring of the coming year in 2021. So if you want to win an election, you have to win the suburbs of Toronto. So Western Canada and Western Canadian voices, particularly in agriculture, have to find a way to have common cause with people who live in the suburbs of the city of Toronto, but also in the suburbs of Vancouver and also in the suburbs of Montreal. So those suburban voters, keep in mind, they are commuters. They work disproportionately in the private sector, and a disproportionate number of them are new Canadians. What do you have to say to them?
So can agriculture find an ally in the suburbs? It's a good question politically, for sure. And with all of this is obviously, and we saw this with some of the conversations about the hardness of butter here in the last month. We're still trying to figure out not just how we politically align or don't align with some of our consumers in urban areas, but also at the same time how we communicate the why of certain things happening on the farm versus some of the perceptions. So it's this is a topic that's going to continue to spin and spin and spin and go on. It can kind of go on forever. Comment here from Dieter. I watched infrastructure, it was rail, getting pulled out of my small town because it was owned by private interests. Despite this going against my political leanings, is there some infrastructure that might be better public/government hands to protect rural interests? I like how you put the disclaimer in there, Dieter. No, this is like totally against my political aspect. Anyway, well, the question is, some people think that on broadband, that the government should be doing more to put money and to encourage the investment in rural broadband infrastructure. Of course, we've seen Starlink, Telesat, these LEOs, these low Earth orbit satellites, providing high speed, like fiber-like high-speed internet to rural communities. That's the private companies coming in, which may let the government kind of off the hook. Now, in some cases, like in Telesat, I believe, the government has made, it's a private company, but government has made significant investments in trying to help them out to provide that technology. So it's not just all private that's making that happen. So yeah, it's I think it's a very, very good, it's a good question. This is the same kind of question that comes with something like Protein Industries Canada, where there is a supercluster providing, government's putting up dollars, and there's you put an application in, and the whole goal is to build the plant protein processing sector, 3Ps, in Canada, right? And so not to wait, just not say, hey, let the market do it, but trying to trigger the investment from private companies to try to make the Canada a dominant player in pulse processing globally, right? So that, I think it kind of falls into the same sort of question. Now, would I ever trust government to run something really, really well in a full ownership situation? That's a whole nother debate, and I would probably guess more or assume more to it's not usually the best kind of scenario, but for a true public good where there's nobody willing to do the private investment, it probably does have a fit in some cases. Dieter says Manitoba Hydro is of current concern, but more immediate even is the lack of natural gas infrastructure for grain drying. Yeah, this is something for someone from Alberta. It's where there's natural gas everywhere. When we had the whole propane shortage going back to the rail blockades, I really did not realize how everybody just doesn't have natural gas. And that may sound really stupid, and I'm not scared to say when I don't know something. And how much people were relying on things like propane instead of there just being a natural gas hookup. It felt weird to somebody from Alberta for sure. So I really think that the rural-urban divide issue is something that we're going to continue to battle politically when it comes to electing governments. But at the same time, it's also about policy. And we talked about this in regards to things like the federal climate plan. Agriculture is having a very, very difficult time getting in the minds of people like Environment Minister Wilkinson to try to get them to understand why there is no substitute for using gas or propane for grain drying. There are no solar or wind-powered grain dryers out there. It's not a substitute. That's just one example where we have real challenges ahead of us when as the government gets more urban, it becomes more and more difficult for people to understand what the heck we are talking about, whether that's raising livestock, growing crops, or whatever, aquaculture, whatever else is going on the farm. It becomes more and more difficult to communicate. We need to be much more strategic about the way we do communicate with some of our fellow Canadian peers in government. So it's definitely a challenge. Hey, I really appreciate everybody joining us here today. An important topic. We're going to keep rolling with some of these Freestyle Fridays, so to speak. I'm not going to rap, but I can talk, and I like bringing some of these clips out of the woodwork and showcasing some of the people we've talked to on some of these threads of thought. So I want to remind everybody to check out RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147 on Sirius XM, 4:30 Eastern, 2:30 Mountain. Or, of course, you can download the podcast as well. We got a great panel today. Lindsay Smith, Kelvin Hepner, and Christina Crowley-Arkley. And the whole show is the panel, and it's absolutely fantastic. Everybody have yourselves a great weekend. I'm going to go find a patio and maybe have a beer. Thanks so much for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live. Cheers, everybody.